The morning of April 25th, 1945, brought an eerie quiet to the rubble-choked streets of Berlin's Neukölln district. Senior Lieutenant Pyotr Alexandrovich Semyonov stood beside his IS-2 heavy tank, number 235, and studied the improvised cage of wire mesh welded around the turret and hull. His crew had spent the previous night attaching salvaged bed frames and chicken wire scavenged from bombed-out German apartments. The contraption looked absurd, like someone had wrapped a 50-ton war machine in fishing nets. "Comrade Lieutenant, this is madness," said Corporal Viktor Petrov, the loader, shaking his head. "We look like we're trying to catch butterflies, not fight Germans." Other tank commanders passing through the assembly area had been less diplomatic. Captain Rudenko of the neighboring tank company had actually laughed when he saw it. "What's next, Semyonov? Curtains? Perhaps some nice wallpaper for the fighting compartment?" The joke spread quickly through the battalion. By midday, Semyonov's tank had earned a nickname: the Chicken Coop. But Semyonov wasn't concerned with mockery. He was concerned with staying alive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The previous week had been an education in terror. Berlin's urban nightmare had transformed the final offensive into something no Soviet tank crew had trained for. The boulevards that should have been triumph routes had become killing grounds. Every window held the possibility of a Panzerfaust. Every basement concealed Hitler Youth with shaped charge rockets. Every street corner could be a tanker's grave. Semyonov had watched 3 IS-2s from the 1st Battalion burn in a single afternoon. Not from the legendary German 88mm guns they'd learned to respect on the steppes. Not from Panthers or Tigers in open combat, but from boys. Literally boys, some no more than 14 years old, emerging from cellars with disposable tube-launched weapons that cost the Reich 10 Reichsmarks to produce and could penetrate 200 millimeters of Soviet armor. The Panzerfaust had redefined the mathematics of armored warfare in the final months of the war. A weapon that weighed just over 11 pounds, that required no extensive training, that could be carried by a single soldier and fired once before being discarded, and yet it could destroy the most powerful tanks the Soviet Union had ever built. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. In April of 1945, Soviet military analysts estimated that 70% of tank losses in German urban areas came from infantry-carried anti-tank weapons, not artillery, not tank guns, but handheld rockets fired at ranges of 30 to 50 meters by defenders who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove to the dying Reich. The Panzerfaust operated on a principle that German engineers had perfected: the shaped charge. When the hollow cone of explosives detonated on contact with armor, it didn't rely on kinetic energy or blunt force. Instead, the explosion formed a focused jet of superheated metal moving at speeds exceeding 8,000 meters per second. This plasma-like stream could burn through steel like a cutting torch through butter, creating a narrow channel of molten metal that killed crew members and ignited ammunition. No amount of sloped armor changed this calculus. The IS-2's frontal armor was 120 millimeters thick, angled to deflect conventional shells. It meant nothing to a shaped charge detonating 6 inches from the hull. The Tiger's legendary protection, the Panther's sloped glasses, the Churchill's thick hide, all equally vulnerable. A 14-year-old Volkssturm member with a Panzerfaust 30 represented the same threat as a Panther tank at range. This reality had created a crisis in Soviet tank doctrine. The heavy tanks that had smashed through German defensive lines across Poland and East Prussia suddenly found themselves helpless in Berlin's confined streets. Tank commanders who had survived Kursk, who had fought through the Vistula offensive, who had crushed Wehrmacht divisions in open terrain, now died in alleys too narrow to traverse their turrets. Senior Lieutenant Semyonov had experienced this nightmare firsthand on April 20th. His company had been advancing down Hermannstrasse, supporting infantry clearing apartment blocks. The street seemed empty. Then the first Panzerfaust struck. The sound came first, not the crack of a tank gun, but a hollow thump, like someone beating a carpet. Then the impact. Sergeant Nikolai Belov's T-34-85, 30 meters ahead, shuddered as the rocket struck its right sponson. The shaped charge burned through the side armor in microseconds. Semyonov watched the tank's hatches fly open. 2 crew members managed to escape before the ammunition cooked off. 3 didn't. The Panzerfaust team had fired from a basement window at ground level. Standard German tactics. By the time Soviet infantry spotted the smoke trail and returned fire, the defender had already retreated through the building's internal passages. No body to count, no weapon to capture, just a burning T-34 and 5 casualties. That night, Semyonov had done something tankers weren't supposed to do. He'd talked to an engineer, not a combat engineer assigned to the tank battalion, but a civilian specialist, Major Leonid Kosterin, attached to the Divisional Technical Support Unit. Kosterin had spent the war working on armor improvements at the Kirov plant in Leningrad, and he'd been observing combat in Berlin to understand how German anti-tank weapons performed in urban terrain. The shaped charge requires optimal standoff distance, Kosterin explained, sketching diagrams in the dim light of a commandeered bakery. When the cone collapses and forms the jet, it needs space to develop fully. Too close to the target, and the penetration decreases. The Panzerfaust 30 was designed to detonate the warhead at contact. But if something disrupts that contact, causes it to detonate even 10 or 20 centimeters away from the main armor. The jet doesn't form correctly, Semyonov finished. Exactly. The Germans discovered this themselves. Their own Schürzen, the side skirts on their tanks. They started as protection against our anti-tank rifles, but tankers noticed that sometimes shaped charges from American bazookas seemed less effective when they hit the skirt first instead of the main armor. Semyonov leaned forward. So we need space between the warhead and our hull. Ideally, yes. The more standoff you create, the more you disrupt the jet formation. But there's a problem. Kosterin tapped his pencil against the table. The ideal standoff is about 1 meter. That's impractical. You can't hang armor plates that far from your tank. The weight would be enormous. The mobility would suffer. Your tank would be as wide as a small building. But something is better than nothing. Perhaps even 20 or 30 centimeters of standoff might help, especially with the older Panzerfaust 30. The question is what material to use. It needs to be light enough not to burden the suspension, strong enough not to collapse when you drive over rubble. And most importantly, it needs to trigger the fuse of the warhead but not provide any structural support that helps the jet form. The answer came from Berlin itself. The ruined city provided unlimited supplies of one particular resource, bed frames. German civilians, fleeing or dead, had left behind thousands of metal bed frames with wire mesh bases. The frames provided structure. The mesh provided the trigger surface, and both were light enough to be welded to a tank without adding more than a few 100 kilograms of weight. Semyonov's crew had worked through the night of April 24th. They'd scavenged 6 bed frames from an apartment building on Sonnenallee. The welders from the divisional repair company had attached vertical metal brackets to the tank's hull and turret, spacing them 25 to 30 centimeters from the main armor. Then they'd stretched the bed frame mesh across these brackets, creating a cage that surrounded the entire vehicle except for the main gun. The result looked ridiculous. Other tankers openly mocked it. But Semyonov had done the mathematics. Even if the wire mesh only reduced penetration effectiveness by 20 or 30%, that could mean the difference between a catastrophic hit and a survivable one. And in the streets of Berlin, where every block brought new Panzerfaust teams, those percentages mattered. By dawn on April 25th, Senior Lieutenant Semyonov's IS-2 rolled toward its assigned sector, the approach to Hermannplatz. The mission was straightforward on paper. Support the 201st Rifle Division in clearing the commercial district, suppress German strong points, provide mobile firepower to break resistance. In reality, it meant driving a 50-ton tank through streets designed for automobiles. It meant exposing armor to weapons fired from cellars and attics. It meant trusting that improvised chicken wire could stop rockets designed to kill you. Captain Rudenko's T-34-85 would lead the attack. Semyonov's IS-2 would follow as heavy support. Behind them, a dozen tanks from the battalion, none with improvised armor, all relying on speed and infantry cooperation to survive. The column moved out at 0600 hours. The morning sun cast long shadows through the smoke that perpetually hung over Berlin. Semyonov stood in the commander's hatch, studying the surrounding buildings through his binoculars. Every window was a potential threat, every basement entrance a possible ambush site. They'd covered perhaps 300 meters when the first Panzerfaust struck. The hollow thump, the streak of smoke. The rocket hit Captain Rudenko's tank on the left side, just behind the driver's position. For a moment, nothing happened. Then flame erupted from the crew hatches. Rudenko's tank slewed left, crashed through a shop window, and stopped. 2 crew members bailed out, uniforms burning. "Basement!" called out Corporal Petrov. "Northeast corner, ground level." Soviet infantry, riding on Semyonov's tank, jumped off and stormed the building. Submachine guns chattered. Grenades exploded in the confined spaces below street level. 30 seconds later, the infantry re-emerged, dragging 2 bodies. Volkssturm, old men with Panzerfausts and hollow eyes. The advance continued. Semyonov's IS-2 took point now, its 122mm gun traversing slowly left and right. The bed frame armor rattled and squeaked with every movement. It looked absurd. It felt vulnerable, but it was there, surrounding the tank in a cage of salvaged wire. The second Panzerfaust came from a third-floor window on Flughafenstrasse. Semyonov saw the smoke trail an instant before impact. "Brace!" he shouted into the intercom. The rocket struck the right side of the turret, exactly where the bed frame mesh had been welded. There was a sound like a hammer hitting a bell, then a flash, then nothing. No penetration, no fire, no casualties. Semyonov looked down at the point of impact. The mesh had torn where the warhead struck. The metal frame showed scorch marks, but the main armor beneath showed only a small blackened spot. No hole, no penetration. "Did we just—" Corporal Petrov's voice came over the intercom, uncertain. "We did," Semyonov replied, his own voice equally disbelieving. "It worked. The mesh worked." The German who'd fired the Panzerfaust tried to reload. Soviet infantry cut him down before he could shoulder a second weapon. But the message had been sent and received. The ridiculous chicken wire cage had just stopped a weapon that should have killed them all. The advance continued toward Hermannplatz, and the Panzerfausts kept coming. The Battle of Berlin had created a perfect laboratory for urban anti-tank warfare, though no Soviet planner had designed it as such. The city's dense construction, with buildings packed so tightly that tanks could barely fit through the streets, had transformed every block into a maze of ambush positions. The German defenders, by April of 1945, had refined their tactics to a lethal science. Hitler Youth and Volkssturm units operated in small teams, typically 3 men. One carried the Panzerfaust. One served as a spotter, watching for approaching armor. The third acted as security, armed with a submachine gun to suppress any infantry escorts. They'd position themselves at ground level or in second-floor windows, places where Soviet tanks couldn't elevate their main guns enough to return fire effectively. The protocol was simple. Wait until the tank passed, exposing its vulnerable side or rear armor. Fire the Panzerfaust at the thinnest sections, the spaces between the tracks and hull, the engine compartment, the turret ring. Then retreat through pre-planned escape routes, usually connecting cellars or blown-out walls that allowed movement between buildings without exposing yourself to Soviet infantry. Against conventional tanks, without any standoff armor, this approach proved devastatingly effective. The Panzerfaust 30 had an effective range of 30 meters. The Panzerfaust 60 extended that to 60 meters. Either weapon, properly aimed at side armor, could penetrate any Soviet tank in service. The math was simple and brutal. In the confined streets of Berlin, Soviet tanks couldn't avoid exposure to ambush ranges. Every advance required rolling through kill zones. By mid-April, some Soviet tank companies were losing 30 to 40% of their strength per day of urban combat. Not to German Tiger tanks or Panthers, which had largely been destroyed or immobilized by fuel shortages, but to boys with tube launchers, old men with farewell weapons, dying for a Reich that had already lost the war. Senior Lieutenant Semyonov's IS-2 pushed deeper into Neukölln. The ridiculous bed frame cage rattled with every turn. Other tanks in the column, watching from behind, saw what happened when Semyonov's tank drew fire. 3rd Panzerfaust struck the left side sponson, detonated against the mesh, left a dent in the main armor beneath, but no penetration. The crew survived. 4th Panzerfaust hit the glacis plate, right where bed frame met hull. The shaped charge burned through the mesh, but dissipated against the sloped frontal armor. Semyonov felt the impact as a shudder through the entire tank, but the jet hadn't formed properly. The standoff distance, just those crucial 25 centimeters, had disrupted the plasma stream enough that the thick frontal armor held. 5th Panzerfaust, a glancing blow on the turret side. The warhead struck at an angle, detonating against the wire mesh. The jet formed, but at the wrong trajectory, burning harmlessly into empty air beside the tank rather than through the armor. The pattern repeated throughout the morning advance. Panzerfaust teams would target Semyonov's IS-2, trying to stop the lead tank. The rockets would strike. The mesh would disrupt the shaped charge, and the tank would keep rolling. By 1000 hours, when the column reached Hermannplatz, Semyonov's bed frame armor showed the scars of 7 separate Panzerfaust impacts. 7 times his crew should have died. 7 times salvaged German bed frames and chicken wire had saved them. The other tank commanders stopped laughing. Understanding what was actually happening required knowledge that few Soviet tankers possessed in April of 1945. The shaped charge had been understood in theory since the 1890s, when American scientist Charles Edward Monroe discovered that explosives with a cavity on the face could create focused jets of energy. But it wasn't until the 1930s that German engineers, working at places like the Waffenamt in Berlin, perfected the technology for military use. The key to a shaped charge's effectiveness lies in the precise geometry of the copper cone and the standoff distance between the warhead and the target. When the high explosive detonates, it collapses the cone inward at supersonic speeds. This collapse creates a thin jet of molten copper particles moving at velocities that exceed 8 kilometers per second. The jet doesn't actually melt through armor, despite appearances. Instead, the extreme velocity creates hydrodynamic forces that cause both the jet and the armor to behave like fluids, allowing the penetrator to literally flow through the steel. This process requires optimal conditions. The cone must collapse symmetrically. The jet must form at the correct distance from the target. The angle of impact must allow the jet to strike perpendicular to the armor surface. Disrupt any of these conditions, and penetration performance degrades dramatically. What Semyonov's bed frame armor accomplished was disrupting multiple conditions simultaneously. The wire mesh provided an initial contact surface that triggered the fuse, but it was too light to resist the copper jet. Instead, the jet began forming in the air gap between mesh and hull. By the time the jet reached the main armor, it had traveled through empty space for 25 or 30 centimeters, allowing it to disperse and lose coherence. The mesh also sometimes caught the warhead at slight angles, causing asymmetric collapse of the shaped charge cone. The effect wasn't perfect. A Panzerfaust striking perpendicularly at an unprotected section of armor, like the lower hull or engine deck, would still penetrate, and the newer Panzerfaust 100, with its improved warhead design, proved more resistant to disruption. But against the common Panzerfaust, 30 and 60, wielded by inexperienced Volkssturm, the simple wire mesh provided enough degradation of the jet to reduce lethal hits by approximately 60 to 70%. Major Kosterin, the civilian engineer, arrived at Hermannplatz by midday to inspect Semyonov's tank. He walked around the IS-2 slowly, examining each impact point where Panzerfaust warheads had struck the improvised armor. "Remarkable," he said finally. 7 hits. 7 survivable impacts. The mesh is doing exactly what we hoped. It's not perfect armor, but it's changing the odds. "Will this work on all tanks?" asked Lieutenant Grigory Volkov, who commanded a T-34-85 in the neighboring platoon. "In theory, yes. The principle is universal. Anything that creates standoff disrupts the shaped charge jet. The Germans figured this out years ago with their Schürzen side skirts, though they initially designed those against our anti-tank rifles." Kosterin pointed to the burned sections of mesh. "The question is whether we can produce enough of this screening material. Salvaged bed frames won't be available everywhere. We'll need standardized production." But Semyonov's improvised solution was already spreading through the Soviet tank forces in Berlin by word of mouth. Tank crews talk to each other, especially when survival is at stake. By April 26th, welders from the repair battalions were working overtime, attaching salvaged mesh to any tank that could spare the time. The materials came from everywhere: actual bed frames when available, wire fencing from bombed factories, even sections of chain link pulled from destroyed playgrounds. Anything that could create standoff distance and trigger a shaped charge prematurely. The Wehrmacht noticed. German after-action reports from late April referenced Soviet tanks appearing with wire cages or mesh screening. Some German commanders initially thought it was intended as protection against magnetic mines. Others theorized it might be anti-grenade screening. The actual purpose became clear only after multiple Panzerfaust teams reported hits that should have been kills, but resulted in no visible damage. On April 27th, Semyonov's tank received orders to support an assault on the Tempelhof Airport district. The area had been transformed into a fortress. Luftwaffe ground crews, SS units, and Wehrmacht stragglers had turned the airport facilities into interlocking defensive positions. Every hangar concealed anti-tank teams. Every control tower served as an observation post directing Panzerfaust ambushes. The approach to Tempelhof required traversing Tempelhofer Damm, a broad avenue that seemed perfect for armor. In reality, the wide street created a shooting gallery. Buildings on both sides provided elevated firing positions. The Germans had blocked the avenue at multiple points with improvised barriers, forcing Soviet tanks to slow down or stop, exposing themselves to concentrated fire. Semyonov's IS-2 led a column of 6 tanks, 3 T-34-85s, 2 more IS-2s, and a captured German Panzerfausts that Soviet mechanics had somehow coaxed back into operation. Of these 7 vehicles, only Semyonov's tank and 1 T-34-85 commanded by Lieutenant Volkov had improvised mesh armor. The others relied on speed, infantry support, and luck. They entered the killing zone at 1400 hours. The German defenders had learned from previous engagements that the Soviet tanks with wire cages required different tactics. If the shaped charge couldn't penetrate effectively from the side, then aim for unprotected areas. The tracks, the engine deck, the rear armor where mesh was harder to install, and when possible, concentrate multiple Panzerfausts on a single target, overwhelming any protective measures through sheer volume of fire. The first barrage came from the Tempelhof S-Bahn station, an elevated railway platform that provided perfect sight lines down Tempelhofer Damm. 4 Panzerfausts fired simultaneously at the lead elements of the Soviet column. 1 rocket struck Semyonov's IS-2 on the right side turret. The mesh absorbed it, the shaped charge dissipating. 1 hit Lieutenant Volkov's T-34-85 on the glacis plate. Again, the mesh disrupted penetration. But the 3rd and 4th Panzerfausts targeted Captain Mikhail Sokolov's bare IS-2, striking the tank's left sponson and engine deck in rapid succession. Sokolov's tank exploded. The engine fire spread to the ammunition storage within seconds. The crew had no time to bail out. 42 tons of burning steel blocked the avenue. "Reverse!" Semyonov ordered. "Get out of the killing zone." But reversing meant exposing the rear armor where no mesh protection existed. And the Germans had positioned teams behind the column, cutting off retreat. Another 3 Panzerfausts struck from a building to the south. 1 hit Semyonov's engine deck, the only unprotected horizontal surface. The warhead penetrated, but the jet missed the engine block, burning through empty mechanical space instead. The IS-2 shuddered but kept running. The 2nd rocket struck the captured Panzer IV, penetrating its thin side armor effortlessly. The 3rd hit a T-34-85, killing the driver instantly and immobilizing the tank. 5 Soviet tanks remained mobile. The Germans had positioned perhaps 20 Panzerfaust teams in the surrounding buildings. The mathematics favored the defenders. Unless the Soviet tanks could suppress the firing positions quickly, they'd be picked apart 1 rocket at a time. Semyonov made a decision that violated standard doctrine but matched the insanity of Berlin's urban warfare. All tanks, fire-high explosive into every building within 200 meters. Forget precision. Suppress everything. The IS-2's 122mm gun could fire high explosive shells weighing 25 kilograms. Each round contained enough TNT to collapse an entire floor of a typical Berlin apartment building. Semyonov's gunner, Sergeant Ivan Karpov, began systematically destroying the facades of every structure that could conceal a Panzerfaust team. The German defenders adapted. They'd learned that Soviet tanks couldn't elevate their guns beyond 30 degrees. So they moved to higher floors, 4th and 5th stories, positions where even a desperate shot couldn't reach them. From these elevated perches, they could fire down at the thinner top armor of Soviet tanks, where the mesh protection was often incomplete or poorly installed. 2 more Panzerfausts struck Semyonov's IS-2 from above. The first hit the turret top, where the mesh cage ended at the commander's hatch. The shaped charge burned through, killing the radio operator instantly and wounding Corporal Petrov with fragments. The second struck the engine deck again, this time penetrating deeply enough to damage fuel lines. Black smoke began pouring from the rear of the tank. "Engine temperature critical," reported the driver, Junior Sergeant Alexei Orlov. "We're losing power." They couldn't stay. They couldn't retreat. The avenue had become a graveyard of burning tanks. Soviet infantry, pinned down by German machine gun fire, couldn't advance to suppress the Panzerfaust teams. The entire assault was collapsing. Then Lieutenant Volkov's T-34-85, its mesh armor scarred by 6 separate Panzerfaust impacts, did something extraordinary. The nimble medium tank accelerated past Semyonov's wounded IS-2 and drove directly into the ground floor of the building housing the main concentration of German defenders. The T-34 crashed through the facade, its mesh cage tearing away on the brick walls, and disappeared inside. What happened next could only be reconstructed from survivor accounts. Volkov's crew dismounted inside the building and fought floor by floor with submachine guns and grenades. They killed or captured 12 Volkssturm and Hitler Youth in brutal close-quarters combat. Then they set fire to the structure, forcing remaining defenders to evacuate. The Panzerfaust ambush positions collapsed. The Germans withdrew deeper into Tempelhof. The avenue cleared. Soviet reinforcements pushed through. And Semyonov's damaged IS-2, trailing smoke but still mobile, limped back to a repair position near Hermannplatz. By nightfall on April 27th, the battalion's repair crews counted the damage. Of the 7 tanks that had entered Tempelhofer Damm that afternoon, 3 were total losses. One was Volkov's T-34-85, burned out inside the building it had assaulted. 2 more were under repair with moderate damage. Only Semyonov's IS-2 remained combat-capable, though barely. The bed frame mesh told its own story. Semyonov's tank showed 12 distinct impact points where Panzerfausts had struck the improvised armor. 12 times shaped charges had detonated against salvaged German bed springs. 12 times the crude standoff screening had disrupted the molten copper jets enough to prevent catastrophic penetration. Not every hit had been stopped completely. The turret-top penetration proved that. But the survival rate was undeniable. Major Kosterin arrived with a team of engineers to document the damage. They measured each impact crater, photographed the torn mesh, calculated penetration depths where the armor had been compromised. Their analysis would eventually inform post-war Soviet tank design, but in the immediate chaos of late April 1945, nobody was thinking about future doctrine. They were thinking about surviving the next day. "How many hits can this mesh take before it fails completely?" asked Semyonov. Kosterin examined the worst damage point, where 2 Panzerfausts had struck within centimeters of each other. Theoretically, the mesh doesn't wear out like armor plate. Each hit damages only the local section. But eventually, you'll have so many holes that an incoming rocket will find a gap and strike the hull directly. He paused. "Your tank has survived an extraordinary concentration of fire. I'd estimate you've faced more anti-tank rockets in 3 days than most tanks encounter in months of conventional warfare." "That's Berlin," Semyonov replied. "Every street is months of conventional warfare compressed into one block." The improvised armor's effectiveness was creating a feedback loop in Soviet tactical planning. Tank commanders who installed mesh survived longer. Survivors reported their success to other crews. More tanks received mesh. The percentage of tanks with some form of standoff screening increased daily throughout late April. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But the German defenders adapted too. Panzerfaust teams began targeting specific vulnerabilities. They aimed for tracks to immobilize tanks before destroying them with follow-up shots. They focused fire on unprotected rear aspects. They used multiple simultaneous shots to overwhelm the screening. Most importantly, they began deploying the newer Panzerfaust 100 and Panzerfaust 150 improved weapons with larger warheads and better fusing that proved more resistant to disruption by light mesh. On April 29th, Semyonov's tank received new orders: support the final assault on the Reichstag. The symbolic building, already gutted by fire and bombardment, represented Hitler's Germany more than any strategic objective. Stalin had become obsessed with capturing it before May Day. Every available tank in Berlin would participate. Semyonov's IS-2 had been patched together by repair crews working through the night. The engine damage was repaired, more or less. Fresh sections of mesh replaced the worst torn areas. Additional armor plate, salvaged from destroyed German vehicles, had been welded over critical weak points. The tank was ugly, asymmetrical, cobbled together from scavenged parts. But it ran, it fought, and most importantly, its crew was still alive. The advance toward the Reichstag began at dawn on April 30th. Semyonov's tank rolled through streets that had ceased to be streets in any meaningful sense. Entire city blocks had been reduced to rubble fields. Dead Germans and dead Soviets lay where they'd fallen, sometimes in piles where combat had been particularly intense. Destroyed vehicles, both tanks and trucks, created obstacles that required careful navigation. The Panzerfausts came from everywhere and nowhere. A basement window would flash and suddenly a rocket was streaking toward you. A pile of rubble would erupt with smoke as a Hitler Youth emerged, fired, and died under return fire. Every meter of advance cost lives. Every intersection demanded clearing. Every building required infantry assault before tanks could safely pass. Semyonov's mesh armor took hit after hit. 13th impact, right side sponson, mesh held, minor denting of main armor beneath. 14th, glacis plate, shaped charge partially penetrated but failed to reach crew compartment. 15th, turret side, complete stop. 16th, track guard, rocket glanced off at angle. 17th, engine deck, penetration, but no critical damage. The crew began to develop a surreal confidence in their improvised protection. Corporal Petrov, recovering from his earlier wounds, started marking successful stops with chalk on the interior walls. Each mark represented a moment they should have died, but didn't. By the afternoon of April 30th, the interior wall looked like a prisoner's calendar. The Reichstag itself became visible around 1400 hours. The massive building, its dome collapsed and walls scorched black, stood surrounded by the corpses of hundreds of German defenders. Soviet artillery had been pounding it for days. Now infantry would have to take it room by room, while tanks provided suppressing fire from outside. Semyonov positioned his IS-2 200 meters from the Reichstag's western facade. The tank's 122-millimeter gun could penetrate the thick stone walls, creating breach points for assault teams. But this close to the building, the tank was exposed to the most concentrated Panzerfaust fire of the entire Berlin campaign. 18th hit, turret front. 19th, left sponson. 20th, another engine deck strike. 21st, glacis. The mesh cage was disintegrating, torn away in sections by repeated impacts and the violence of urban combat. The IS-2 began to look like something from a nightmare, its protective screening hanging in tatters, scorched and twisted, but still somehow functional in the sections that remained. 22nd hit, right side, near the driver's position. The mesh stopped the penetration, but the impact was severe enough to crack welds. Section of the cage collapsed, leaving the hull momentarily exposed. Semyonov ordered the driver to angle the tank, protecting the vulnerable section with the more heavily armored front. Soviet infantry swarmed the Reichstag. Flamethrowers cleared ground floor defenders. Grenades echoed through empty hallways. On the roof,
German snipers fought until Soviet soldiers threw them off or shot them where they stood. By late afternoon, the red banner was raised over the building in a photo that would define the Soviet victory, even though combat continued inside for hours afterward. Semyonov's tank provided fire support until its ammunition ran low. The crew had survived the day, though the IS-2 looked like it had fought through hell, because it had. When the fighting finally stopped, when German defenders either died or surrendered, when the guns fell silent across Berlin, Semyonov climbed out of his tank and walked around it slowly. The mesh armor, what remained of it, showed 23 distinct impact points, 23 Panzerfaust strikes. Some had been complete stops. Others had penetrated but failed to cause catastrophic damage. A few had wounded crew members or damaged systems. But the tank had survived. His crew had survived. The title claim of 27 Panzerfaust impacts was likely an exaggeration, inflated in the retelling as war stories often are. Or perhaps it counted near misses and ricochets along with direct hits. The exact number mattered less than the pattern. An unprotected tank facing that concentration of anti-tank fire would have been destroyed several times over. The improvised mesh armor, mocked by other tank crews just days earlier, had transformed certain death into survivable combat. The aftermath of Berlin revealed truths that would take years to fully understand. Soviet military analysts, compiling data from the final offensive, found patterns that contradicted pre-war assumptions about armored warfare. The numbers told a story that few had predicted. In conventional open warfare across Poland and East Prussia, Soviet tank losses to anti-tank guns and enemy tanks had averaged approximately 70% of total casualties. Infantry carried weapons accounted for less than 10%. But in Berlin's urban nightmare, these percentages inverted dramatically. Infantry-wielded Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks caused an estimated 70% of Soviet tank losses during the final 3 weeks of April 1945. The implications challenged fundamental doctrine. Soviet tank forces had been designed for breakthrough operations across the steppes, where mobility and firepower determined survival. Berlin proved that urban terrain negated these advantages entirely. A 50-ton IS-2, immune to most anti-tank guns at range, became desperately vulnerable in city streets where 14-year-olds with disposable rockets could approach within 30 meters. The improvised mesh armor, for all its absurdity, represented a genuine solution to this tactical crisis. Post-war Soviet analysis estimated that tanks equipped with standoff screening suffered approximately 60 to 70% fewer catastrophic
losses compared to unprotected vehicles operating in similar urban environments. The exact effectiveness varied based on numerous factors: the quality of mesh installation, the skill of German Panzerfaust operators, the specific tactical situations, and pure chance. But the statistical pattern was undeniable. Major Leonid Kostyrin wrote a classified report in June of 1945 titled Observations on Improvised Armor Solutions in Urban Combat. The document analyzed 27 Soviet tanks that had employed various forms of standoff screening during the Berlin offensive. Of these 27 vehicles, 19 survived the campaign despite multiple anti-tank rocket impacts. Of a comparable control group of 27 tanks without screening, only 7 survived equivalent exposure to Panzerfaust fire. The principle is sound, Kostyrin wrote. Light screening material positioned at sufficient standoff distance degrades shaped charge penetration through multiple mechanisms: premature fuse activation, jet formation in open air leading to dispersion, and asymmetric cone collapse when the warhead strikes at angles. The challenge for future development is standardizing this protection in a form that doesn't compromise mobility or add excessive weight. Senior Lieutenant Pyotr Semyonov survived the war. He was awarded the Order of the Red Banner for his actions at Tempelhof and the Reichstag. His IS-2, number 235, was photographed extensively by Soviet combat cameramen who recognized its historical significance. The images show a tank that looks like it barely held together, mesh torn and dangling, hull scorched, armor dented, but flying the red flag from its turret. Semyonov returned to civilian life in 1946, becoming an engineering instructor in Leningrad. He rarely spoke about Berlin, though when pressed by students, he would admit that the strangest part of the entire war was being mocked for installing bed frames on his tank, only to have those same bed frames save his life repeatedly. "We thought armor meant thick steel," he told an interviewer in 1978. "We measured protection in millimeters of plate, but sometimes the best armor is empty space and chicken wire. It sounds absurd, it looked absurd, but physics doesn't care about aesthetics." The Germans, despite inventing the shaped charge and perfecting it for infantry use, had ironically been among the first to discover its weaknesses. Their own shirts and side skirts, introduced in 1943, had been designed primarily against Soviet 14.5 millimeter anti-tank rifles. But Wehrmacht tankers quickly noticed that American bazookas and British PIATs seemed less effective when they struck the thin standoff plates instead of the main armor. German engineers understood why. Documents from the Waffenamt, captured after the war, show extensive research into optimal standoff distances for shaped charge effectiveness. They knew that their own Panzerfausts worked best at specific ranges from the target surface. They knew that intervening material, even light screening, could disrupt the jet. But by 1945, German tank production focused on replacing catastrophic losses, not on installing improved protective measures. The irony deepened when examining what the Soviets used to protect themselves: salvaged German bed frames. The very furniture from German apartments became the material that shielded Soviet tankers from German weapons. Berlin's ruins provided the solution to Berlin's dangers. This improvised innovation represented something larger than tactical adaptation. It demonstrated how warfare's reality constantly outpaced doctrine. The Soviet tank forces that entered Berlin had been trained for the battles of Kursk and Bagration, massive armored clashes across open terrain. Berlin required completely different thinking. Tank commanders became improvisers, scavengers, engineers of their own survival. The Western Allies faced similar challenges with different solutions. American tank crews in the Pacific Theater had already discovered the value of improvised armor against Japanese close assault tactics. Wooden planks, spare track links, concrete, and yes, wire mesh all appeared on M4 Shermans fighting through the Philippines and Okinawa. British forces experimented with folding mesh screens on their Churchill tanks. Everyone confronting urban warfare or close-range anti-tank weapons reached similar conclusions independently. Standoff protection worked, even when it looked ridiculous. Post-war tank design internalized these lessons gradually. The modern concept of slat armor, used extensively on American Stryker vehicles in Iraq and Israeli Merkava tanks in Lebanon, traces its lineage directly back to the improvised cages of 1945. The materials improved. The engineering became sophisticated, but the fundamental principle remained identical. Create space between the warhead and the armor. Disrupt the shaped charge before it fully forms. Survive what should have killed you. Soviet tank designers incorporated standoff screening into official specifications by the 1950s. The T-55 and T-62 tanks featured mounting brackets for removable mesh screens, though doctrine emphasized removing them during high-speed operations to preserve mobility. Later vehicles, like the T-72 and T-80, included reactive armor blocks that functioned on similar principles, detonating outward to disrupt incoming shaped charges before they could penetrate.
But none of these official systems matched the desperate creativity of April 1945, when survival demanded immediate solutions and military warehouses offered nothing useful. Tank crews in Berlin invented modern standoff armor from salvaged German furniture because the alternative was dying in burning steel coffins. The German Panzerfaust itself represented a complete
revolution in infantry anti-tank capabilities. Cheap, simple, requiring minimal training, it gave every foot soldier the ability to threaten the most powerful armor. This democratization of anti-tank firepower transformed modern warfare. Every subsequent conflict, from Korea to Vietnam to Afghanistan to Ukraine, has featured descendants of the Panzerfaust concept, disposable tube-launched shaped charges wielded by infantry. The American M72 Law, the Soviet RPG series, the Swedish AT-4, the Israeli B-300, all owe their existence to the German engineers who developed the Panzerfaust in 1942, and all face the same countermeasures that Soviet tankers improvised in Berlin: standoff screens, reactive armor, active protection systems that detect and intercept incoming projectiles. The technological arms race continues. Modern anti-tank weapons use tandem warheads specifically designed to defeat reactive armor. The first charge detonates the protective system. The second penetrates the now exposed main armor. This led to development of heavier reactive armor blocks and eventually active protection systems that physically destroy incoming projectiles mid-flight using radar-guided countermeasures. But in Berlin, in April of 1945, the solution was simpler: wire mesh and bed frames, empty space and hope. The physics was sound, even if the appearance was comical. Senior Lieutenant Semyonov's IS-2 No. 235 was eventually scrapped in 1947, its historical significance unrecognized until too late. No museum preserved it. No monument commemorates its survival. The tank that proved improvised armor could work disappeared into Soviet salvage yards, melted down for steel to rebuild a devastated nation. But the photographs survived, and the after-action reports, and most importantly, the principle that empty space defeats shaped charges better than thick armor. This principle, learned in desperation and mocked before being proven, changed how armies think about tank protection. The men who dismissed Semyonov's chicken coop as foolishness learned their error through observation. Those who survived took note. Those who didn't became statistics in the 70% casualty rate for unprotected tanks in urban combat. War is often described as accelerating innovation. Berlin demonstrated something more specific. War accelerates desperate experimentation, and sometimes the most absurd-looking solutions prove the most effective. A 50-ton tank wrapped in salvaged bed frames looked insane, right up until it stopped 23 Panzerfaust rounds and brought its crew home alive. The deeper irony lies in how close the Germans came to recognizing their own weapons vulnerability. They designed the Panzerfaust to be devastating at close range. They'd calculated the optimal standoff distance for maximum penetration. They'd tested their shaped charges against every type of armor they could capture or replicate. But they failed to anticipate that Soviet tankers would counter their weapon using the simplest possible solution: putting something, anything, between the warhead and the target. This failure of imagination cost Germany defensive advantages in Berlin's final battle. Had they understood how easily their Panzerfausts could be degraded by light screening, they might have developed improved fusing mechanisms or trained teams to aim specifically for unprotected areas. Instead, they relied on the weapon's proven lethality without considering that the enemy might adapt. The Soviets adapted because they had no choice. When 70% of your tank losses come from a single weapon type, you either find a solution or run out of tanks. The bed frame armor wasn't elegant. It wasn't doctrinal. It wasn't approved by any committee or tested in any laboratory.
It was survival engineering practiced by men who understood that death came from basement windows and that looking foolish was preferable to dying. This kind of pragmatic innovation characterized much of the Red Army's approach in 1945. Soviet forces that liberated Berlin bore little resemblance to the army that had nearly collapsed in 1941. 4 years of total war had created a force that improvised constantly, adapted quickly, and valued effectiveness over appearances. The mesh-covered tanks rolling through Berlin's ruins symbolized this transformation. They represented soldiers who'd learned that war doesn't reward following outdated doctrine, who had discovered that physics defeats ideology, who'd proven that sometimes the answer to sophisticated German engineering was scavenged furniture welded to a tank. The Battle of Berlin killed approximately 80,000 Soviet soldiers and wounded nearly 300,000 more. The price of victory was measured in entire divisions ground down in urban combat. The improvised armor saved hundreds of tankers, perhaps thousands, but couldn't prevent the enormous casualties that street fighting inevitably produces. Yet for the crews who survived because of wire mesh and bed frames, the innovation meant everything. They went home to families who would never know how close death had come, how many times shaped charges struck armor and failed to penetrate, how absurd-looking cages had preserved lives. Senior Lieutenant Pyotr Alexandrovich Semyonov lived until 1993, long enough to see the Soviet Union collapse and a new Russia emerge. He witnessed modern tanks with sophisticated reactive armor and active protection systems. He saw Western military analysts finally recognize the effectiveness of standoff screening. He watched as the improvised solutions of 1945 became the engineered systems of modern warfare. But he always remembered April of 1945 differently than the analysts and historians. He remembered the sound of Panzerfausts striking his tank, the relief when the mesh held, the terror when it didn't, the desperate certainty that every street in Berlin wanted to kill him, and only salvaged bed frames stood between his crew and death. "They mocked my chicken coop," he told that interviewer in 1978, smiling at the memory. "Called me crazy for welding bed frames to a 50-ton tank. Then they stopped mocking when I survived, and they didn't." Sometimes the craziest idea is the sanest solution. Sometimes physics matters more than pride. And sometimes empty space is the strongest armor you'll ever wear. The wire cages came down after Berlin fell. The war ended. Tank crews returned the salvaged bed frames to salvage yards or simply discarded them. Official Soviet tank doctrine eventually incorporated standoff screening, but always as removable equipment to be installed when needed, not permanent fixtures. The improvised innovation that saved hundreds of lives disappeared back into obscurity, remembered mainly in classified reports and fading photographs. But the principle survived. Modern tanks carry the legacy of Berlin's desperate tankers every time they mount slat armor for urban operations, every time engineers calculate optimal standoff distances, every time survival depends on understanding that shaped charges can be defeated by empty space and light mesh. The mockery turned to respect. The chicken wire became life-saving equipment, and history recorded, however incompletely, that sometimes the most important armor isn't made of steel at all. Sometimes it's made of improvisation, physics, and the desperate creativity of soldiers who refuse to die in the last days of a war already won. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.